Hello, and welcome to another episode of Pushing Cardboard. This is number 31, John Butterfield, GMT West, and Norman Conquest. There's lots to cover today, so I'll get right to it. Well, the feedback for last episode was good, the initial download numbers were down about 20%, which is pretty huge. My only real idea as to why is that there was no interview last time. I doubt it had anything to do with the games covered, as General Orders and Rebel Fury are by some of the best in the business. I have a few ideas for format changes or schedule changes to try, but for now, I guess I'll just have to ride out the dips when I don't have an interview. Those who did download it seem to like it, as I got a record number of responses in the after episode survey. Thanks to all of you who participate. In any case, those who love interviews are in for a treat today, as we have my talk with John Butterfield when I met him in April at GMT West. I think you're really going to like it. Speaking of GMT West, I'll also give a rundown of my recent trip, and then finish up with a look at the latest game in GMT's Men of Iron series, Norman Conquest. This episode of Pushing Cardboard is sponsored by Noble Knight Games. I'm a happy customer of Noble Knight, as they've helped me find old treasures as well as new games where I missed the pre-order. I encourage you to try them out, and if you do, please go to pushingcardboard.com and use my links to let them know I sent you, or use the link that's in the Pushing Cardboard newsletter. All right, let's get right to it. News. Worthington has a big sale going on. They don't do much for international customers other than point you to local online stores, but if you're in the US, it's a pretty good sale. It's a pity about the way they treat international sales, as other companies have found a way to prepay customs and roll that into the shipping price, and it makes ordering from the States much easier. Anyway, check the newsletter for links to this and anything else mentioned in the podcast as usual. Neva Wargames, that's N-E-V-A, is a new publisher, at least to me. They look to be a one-man operation, judging by the name of that man, Jose Manuel Neva. Perhaps this is another Spanish company, or maybe South American. Who knows? I guess it does me no good to guess. What I can tell you is that they have a website with 3 games in production, one on Spartacus, one on Kursk, and one on Columbus. So check them out. There's a link, as I said before. GMT released their April update just the day after I left on my trip to California, so I didn't get it before my last episode, and I'll recap a bit of it here. Most of it's old news by now, but what the heck. Anyway, they haven't released the May update yet. It'll probably come out as soon as I'm done recording this. So it may be old news as well by the time I get to my next podcast episode. Anyway, in the update, Gene mentions how much he likes Volko Ruhnke's new design, Coast Watchers, and then he spills the beans that there is already a new design coming in that system called Draken. It's about World War I air recon. If you want to hear more about it, check out SD Histcon's June online convention, where I'm going to be interviewing Volko about his new game and about designing systems games in general. In the additions to P500, a couple things caught my eye. There's an expansion for the British Way coming called Enemy of My Enemy. It has 2 completely new games using the Malaya and Palestine maps, as well as a bunch of variants for the existing 4 games. I really like the British Way, so this is a no-brainer for me. I thought it was going to be too simple or not deep enough, and it was just the opposite. I really enjoyed playing all 4 of the games. Speaking of series games, there's already a second title coming after Mark Herman's Rebel Fury. Army of the Potomac will feature the battles of Spotsylvania II, North Anna River, Cold Harbor, and the entire 7 Days battle, including the prelude Seven Pines. Oh man, that guy designs them faster than we can play them. What's on the table? Well, this month, rather than going what I've been playing PBM, I'm just going to recap all the games I played at GMT West, as there were a bunch that aren't on my regular PBEM rotation. I'm getting used to the drive down from Calgary to Hanford, and have started trying alternate routes to see more of the country as I travel. This time I had extra reason to vary the route, as I was dropping in on Richard Handwith from Revolution Games to pick up the most recent 2 Blind Swords releases and save on some shipping charges. Lucky me, and you'll hear more about these 2 down the line. I still got into Hanford in early afternoon on Wednesday, so I was fresh for my 8 a.m. game of District Commander Bin Din, Vietnam 1969, with Nady. This is from Brian Train, and it's part of a series of 4 games that he has using the same system, all published by Hollandspiel. Nady was a great opponent. This was the first time we'd met or played. We set up the game using David Siskin's excellent GMT West Game Finder geek list. Neither of us had played before, so we didn't finish the match, but we played enough to see how the system works. It's got a lot going on. Rather than a simple move and fire type game, you have a whole menu of actions to choose from. It's almost like a coin game, but actually with more actions per side. I was impressed enough to think that I'd try it again. The entry on Board Game Geek says it plays in 120 minutes, but I don't know that that's true if you play the historical scenario. But the great thing is you can set a limit of how many VPs you are playing for, so you can shorten the game that way. Up next, I had a great chat with Jason Carr, Director of Development at GMT, and it'll appear on a future podcast. And then we played Mark Herman's Rebel Fury. Great game. We played the Chickamauga scenario. I had the Rebs, and unfortunately for me, I missed my die roll twice to move Bragg at the beginning, so I never did make it over to the far right flank to cut off his lines of communication. This game was on quite a few tables over the weekend. People seem to really be enjoying it. And if you're interested in game development, make sure to keep an eye out for that interview with Jason. We really got into how the sausage gets made. And then finally on Thursday night, I met up with my podcasting buddy, who's become a gaming buddy, Mark Johnson of Wargames To Go. Check out his podcast if you haven't. It's fantastic. And it's a completely different format from mine in that he does deep dives into campaigns or countries or subjects and looks at a whole lot of games at once. We played 1942 from the recent Compass repackaging of the old GDW Series 120 games. It was originally published in 1983, I think, and this is strictly republishing. The rules haven't been improved or anything like that. At one point in our game, graphics guru Mark Simonich stopped by and he said, "Wow, they used the original graphics files." He totally recognized what we were playing from the map. The hexes and counters have been much enlarged, however, so it's easier on us old guys with fading eyesight. It's a real game for old school hex and counter players. No step losses, real meat and potatoes stuff here. Compass has done a nice job with the package. I managed to eke out a victory here against Mark, but it was a close run thing, and Mark was devising ways he'd play it differently next time by the time we finished. Friday morning, I met up with Joshua. We'd just finished playing the British way via Vassal PBM over the previous few months. At GMT, I caught him the dogfight system in Revolution's Eagles in the Sky. We zipped through a couple 3 versus 3 dogfights and then started a campaign game, and wow, this is where the game really starts to shine. Each player is given a roster of 12 pilots of varying quality and 12 planes, and then missions are generated daily. For our campaign game, it was 2 missions in the morning and then 2 missions in the afternoon. So you know the missions on a day-by-day basis. And then before each mission, each player secretly decides how many fighters to send up. Bombers or recon planes are added at no cost. And then which pilots. Both players reveal, and then there's a chit draw to see if the mission is played out or simulated. If it's simulated, you get random results, but you won't lose anyone. If it's to be played, you get out the board and have your dogfight. After it's done, you record damage, losses, and count up the victory points. Each pilot will get a little more fatigued each time he goes up. Some damage gets repaired between missions, but most needs to wait until overnight. And even then, you can't repair everything. I gotta say, we enjoyed this so much, we decided to keep our results and try to play it live over Vassal, an hour or 2 at a time. It should be fun. We haven't started yet, but we've been in touch, and I'm sure we will get it going. Then after lunch, David Siskin and I played 1812 War on the Great Lakes Frontier from Compass. This was another one where neither of us had played before, but we were both interested in learning it, so we gave it a go. It's a CDG, but when you play a card, you use the event and the ops points. It has a land combat system where each player secretly selects battle posture, frontal attack, refuse flank, feint, frontal, stuff like that, which you then compare, and it's sort of a matrix, and you see how many battle dice each side gets. And then there's a totally separate system for naval combat. I think David maybe found it a bit too fiddly for his taste, but I'm intrigued enough to hope that I can find a PBEM opponent for it. Friday night, I got back together with David and Joshua, and we were joined by Paul for a game of Kingmaker. We were playing on the newly reissued version from Gibson Games. It had two great improvements. The movement system has been changed so that you're mostly just moving from large area to large area unless you're trying to zip across the board on roads. But even better, there's a new set of victory conditions. A card gets placed into the event deck about a third of the way through. Before the game gets to that card, normal victory conditions are in play. That is, you have to be the player or alliance with the sole surviving crowned royal heir. But if that unlikely event hasn't happened before we get to that special card in the deck, then the special victory conditions are triggered. I don't know if there's anything more to it than this, but the way it seemed to play for me was that we had both a time limit and then we had the use of prestige points. There's a chart that tells you how to earn these prestige points, and they're pretty much allied with what you have to do in the regular game. It also tells you how many prestige points you have to earn a victory as a lone player and how many you need in a 2 or 3 player alliance. It was just fantastic. It totally got rid of the long end game of turtling that can often happen in Kingmaker. David and I won an alliance victory just before the time limit was going to expire. I'm happy I got this new version of the game, though I have to say, it's weird. There were a few components that are very, very, very tiny. It seems like a really stupid choice given the deluxe treatment the game otherwise receives in this remake. So then Saturday morning, that's the traditional chat from Gene Billingsley about the state of GMT, and then a brief word from any designers in attendance. The short version from Gene is that they made it through the pandemic just fine and the state of the company is good. He also mentioned that they're changing P500 slightly and they're not going to list games there until they're farther along in the process. That way there'll be less time between when you make your P500 pledge and when the game goes to print. So that sounds like a good idea. Things won't be hung up on P500 forever that way. Anyway, here's a few notes from some of the designers. Mike Berticelli. Wolfpack, his new tactical game about sub-sinking convoys in the North Atlantic in World War I, is almost ready to go to the printer. And he's also got another tank pack coming for Tank Duel, and then is working on Tank Duel West to bring the series to Western Europe. Jared Carmichael, I'm not sure about the designer's name, as I thought I heard a different name in the room compared to what's listed on as the designer here, but I'm going to go with my eyes rather than my ears on this one. Anyway, the game in question is Red Dust Rebellion, wherein the coin series goes to Mars in a sci-fi setting. It's almost ready for the printer as well. Ananda Gupta. Just as the other half of the original design team, Jason Matthew, is working on a new Twilight Struggle design, so is Ananda. His new game is Twilight Struggle Liberation, 1961 to 1990, and it's set in Latin America. Also on his plate is a game titled Underworld Begins, set in the French Revolution, so look out for that. Chris Janicek. Chris is the lead designer on the Down in Flames Wild Blue Yonder series. His news was that he was having to completely overhaul the mechanics for the carrier system that he's now working on for Imperial Eagle, which will be the Pacific module. So it's coming, just not soon. Kai Jensen, in addition to dealing with her late husband's unfinished games, Kai pretty much has the next version of Fighting Formations done. It's on the US 29th Infantry Division and is almost done on the new Combat Commander Big Box, which will bring a ton of Combat Commander stuff together in one big package. And she is working for GMT as number 2 in the production department, so busy lady. Sam London. Sam had a bunch of demos at the convention. Firefight Tactical, of course, which is already on P500. He also had a quick-playing space game called Microverse. He said it takes about 15 minutes per person to play, but many, many people can play, as many as 9, I think, maybe more. I saw John Butterfield sitting in on a game on this. Jerry White. Jerry was another designer I saw playing games all weekend rather than just demoing his own. His next game up is Infernal Machine, about submarines in the American Civil War. And of course, many of you are itching to play Pacific Chase. Jerry says that will hit P500 next year. And then finally, he's working on another in his Skies Above series. Skies Above Guadalcanal is in the early stages still. Mark Simonich. Mark is a quiet guy in public settings, so we got the bare minimum from him. He's working on North Africa 40, which I think is already on P500. It's sort of a prequel to his North Africa 41. And then next up is Italy 43, which he thinks will hit P500 in June. That was it for the designers. Saturday afternoon, I was to play Brothers at War 1862 from Compass Games with Carl Crater, but he was double booked as he's part of the Wargame Boot Camp. But happily, Tim, who I'd met a couple years ago, was also interested in the game, and he jumped in to play me instead. We played one of the Valverde scenarios from the box, and it was a really interesting system. Chit pull, easy movement and combat mechanics, a real keeper, I think. And I have to say, the whole experience was made better by Tim, who's a real fan of tramping battlefields and had been to Valverde several times and could really talk about what was going on in that part of the battle that we were playing. So I got to say a huge thank you to Tim for stepping in and making the experience even better than it might have been. After my game with Tim, I had a chance to interview John Butterfield. You'll hear that in a bit. Great guy and an irrepressible player. We finished that interview about 7:45 at night, and he said, "Oh, good, I still have time for a quick game." So I did as well. I played a game and a half myself after that, and then called it quits about 11. And on my way out, there was John still playing. "Oh, what time is it? 11? Oh, well, we can finish this in the morning," he asked his young opponent, and they did. I got to say, John is a guy who loves to play games. Anyway. Saturday night, it was time for another oldie with Mark Johnson. This one was older than our previous game even. It was World War I by Jim Dunnigan from S&T magazine, circa about 1975. We both really liked this. Fairly quick playing, though he didn't quite finish as Mark had to hit the road home and was staying late just to try to play some of this with me. It's a real design for effect game. Each country has a track for its resource points, a bit like Third Reich, if you've ever played that one from Avalon Hill, though much simpler. Just the idea of the kind of the resource points. Each turn there's movement, and then 3 combat rounds where you can attack with each of your units, each of those 3 rounds if you like. So sort of like movement, combat each time. When you take losses, you generally just reduce your resource track. If you don't want to spend any of those resources, you can retreat. Or you can lose the unit. Units are army size. Resources are used to build new armies, but rebuilding is fairly expensive. So there's some real tension in how to take losses. And I'm sure that as the game gets into the later turns, countries are not going to get enough resources each turn to meet their needs. We really enjoyed it, and we're going to give it a go via PBEM as well and see if that works. I really recommend this one if you can find an old copy. I think also Decision Games has done a reprint of that, and I know Decision Games sometimes doesn't do the best reprints of old SPI games, but I've heard this one's pretty good. So if you can't track down a copy of the old magazine, you might be able to track down a copy from Decision. Anyway, at that point, I thought I was done for the night, but Terry Yoder caught up with me. We'd been talking all weekend about getting in a game of Rommel's War if we found the time, and this was it. This is a new sleek block game from Worthington. Not as deep as Rommel in the Desert, but still there's enough there that it was always going to be in my bag as a game to play in an hour. We really enjoyed it, and Terry decided he liked it enough to buy it, so that says something. I did win the game, but it was a very back and forth affair, and we were both white knuckling it from time to time. So this one's really recommended as a quick 1 hour play. Then it was Sunday. Sundays are much more quiet at GMT West with a few games in the morning, and then most people clearing out by early afternoon. I got in 2 games of The Hunt by Matthias Kramer. First was versus Eugene, and then a second game versus Joshua. Very fun. They both beat me, but both games were super tense and fun and went quite near the end. So I like them both. I'll keep that game in my collection for sure. All in all, I have to say, another great trip to the middle of California. New games for the collection. The Battle of White Plains. As GMT always gives attendees sale prices while at the warehouse event, I got another volume from the Battles of the American Revolution series. And then Austerlitz 1805 Rising Eagles. No discount on this one, but GMT is a distributor for Hexasim, and this is a well-regarded series from Hexasim that I haven't got any of so far, and I wanted to try it out, so I paid full price for this one. And then Campaign for Guadalcanal, Long Lance, and Henderson Field. This was free from Mark Ruggiero's collection. Mark was there playing games, but he also had a stack of games to give away and then also a donation box to help cover his bills as he and his wife are both ill with cancer. Of course, I was happy to contribute, and getting an old game like that was just a bonus. And I got to say, it was great to see Mark there playing games. The guy's a dedicated wargamer, and I'm pretty sure his diagnosis is terminal, and he's just decided to go the whole way, playing games, doing what he loves. So good on him. The other couple games I got, España, 1936. This was a promo copy from Devir. It's a remake of their game on the Spanish Civil War, so look out for a piece on this game farther down the line from me. And then I also received a couple games from VUCA that will see time on the podcast or YouTube channel soon enough. 1812, Napoleon's Fateful March, which I think isn't out yet. That's going to be released in June. And Traces of Hubris. I've opened them both, and in true VUCA style, they're gorgeous. So I look forward to actually playing them, and I'm sure you're going to look forward to seeing them and playing them yourself. And then finally, the last game I bought was Louisbourg 1758 from Worthington. This is supposed to be a lightish game on the siege of Louisbourg that caught my eye, so I did the Kickstarter thing, and here it is. So that's me. That's new games on the table. Newbie tips. Okay, so you've bought a new game, you've skimmed the rules, set it up, and you're ready to dive in. But for many players, this is kind of the next stumbling block. What the hell do I do? What do I do first? I have all these units. What do I do with them? Throw them at the enemy? Attack? Maybe. I don't know. Maybe. At least you'd be teaching yourself movement and how combat works. But if you want to go like just ever so slightly deeper, there's a simple fix to get you moving forward if this is a place that you typically get stuck. Just read or reread the victory conditions. It sounds simple, and it is, but it's easy to forget. Read the victory conditions, and you might decide that attacking right away isn't the best move. The VC might not tell you exactly what to do, but they'll get you thinking about what you want to do. They'll get you thinking that, well, if I need to do such and such to win, how do I accomplish that? Maybe I need to do X or Y to get myself in a position to do, the such and such that I need to win. I know it's not a big thing, but, I find sometimes wargaming rule books can be easy to get yourself lost in. Rereading the VC is a great way to get yourself back on track and focused on the task at hand. Okay, here's my interview with John Butterfield. I have to confess, this is the third time I'd seen John at a GMT West event. The previous two times, I'm sure I could have asked him for an interview either time, but I was a bit awestruck, a bit starstruck. I have so much respect for his body of work, not just its depth, but its breadth. He's an amazing designer, so I didn't want to talk to him and sort of just be talking out of my butt. Anyway, this time I knew I was going down again, so I emailed him ahead of time and set it up so that I couldn't chicken out. And of course, when I talked to him, as you'll hear, he couldn't have been kinder, more humble, and more interesting to talk to. So anyway, here's my interview. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. Hello, I'm here with John Butterfield. We're both at GMT West. How are you, John?
I'm good, thanks, Grant.
This is my first chance to talk with you, but I've been to two of these events before, and I have to admit, each time you were here both times before, but I have to admit I was a little bit starstruck.
Oh, jeez.
I don't want to embarrass you or anything, but I've been playing games a long time, and you've been designing games a long time. Like,
yeah, that's true.
Your roots go back to the SPI days, certainly the Victory Games days.
Yes.
But you worked at SPI before that, even, yeah?
Yes.
And how did you get started as a designer? What was it seems like a million years ago in terms of the way the business has changed, but...
Well, I think like all of us who design and play board games and war games, I was just always fascinated by games and how they work. enjoying playing them, but also enjoying looking at them as a system, as a way to simulate something, not necessarily in detail, but to simulate it to the extent that you enjoy sitting at a table and recreating something through a system that someone put together that allows you to immerse yourself in it. I think when I was a kid, the biggest example of that was Stratomatic baseball. I played that endlessly.
Me too.
And it really made you feel like you were managing a team. And we had leagues even when I was in elementary school that where you could make trades, and we put masking tape on the floor of our bedroom to create little baseball fields, and put our cards in little boxes we made, and it was a lot. And so that was not only immersive for the fun of it, but also it got me exposed to statistics and to probability, because you could really look at, a roll of 2 dice ends up having 36 possibilities, and this is how Stratomatic distributed the stats of the baseball players onto a card. It's like fascinating that could happen, and it worked.
And I played a ton of baseball as well, other sports too, but baseball really lent itself to that because it was the earliest sport where all those stats were, there was batting averages, there were earned run averages, and Stratomatic or Status Pro or whoever you played, they were really making an effort to make the players perform to the same sort of statistics that they had in real life.
Right, and around 1970 or 71, Stratomatic introduced the difference between left-handed batters and right-handed batters and lefty and righty pitchers, and the cards became kind of double-sided. And
that's right. They had the basic side on one side, and then the advanced left versus right.
And I didn't realize that made a difference in baseball.
Yeah,
even though announcers would anecdotally say, "Oh, this is a lefty-lefty matchup." And that evidently meant something. I had no idea what.
Right.
But once I saw it on a Stratomatic card, I was like, wow. Well, I mean, Willie Mays is good when he hits right-handed pitching, but because of lefties, he just murdered them.
What I could never figure out with all that was it seemed that lefty versus lefty was even harder on a batter than righty versus righty. For some reason, lefty was like the absolute murder on left-handed batters.
And and you could see that as you looked at these cards. And I know there are several other tabletop baseball games like APBA and Replay, and the way they presented stats had the same results, but it wasn't immediately visually apparent.
Right.
The layout of Stratomatic really showed it to you and kind of extracted it in a way that was
it's sort
very
of the
easy
king
to
of
read.
Yeah.
Pardon?
It's sort of the king of almost the father, the king of stat-based replay sports games. Strato. I think there's a lot of people who got their start in games in like simulation games in sports rather than the war games and history games we play now.
Yeah, and then I saw so what else in life can be made into a game and that has some, if not simulation, or at least a thematic value to it. And there was some Avalon Hill games that did that, and not the war games. I didn't really play their war games when I was a kid, but I played Air Empire and Dispatcher, and there were a few other of the games. And so this was a game about the airline business. This was a game about trying to keep trains running on time.
You had a business game.
There was a business management game, and then shortly after that, 3M, their first line of games had that sort of thing. It had the stock market game. It had Mr. President. Coincidentally, the same name as the current GMT.
Acquire
was a family favorite.
Right. Yeah.
And so those games were, they were involving game systems that were sometimes abstractly, but simulating something and putting you in the story of it.
So it sounds like you were interested in being in the story, but at the same time, like I know I played a lot of games by myself as a kid because I didn't have anybody to play with. But even if they were 2-player games, but I was always interested to try and figure out how the game worked. And it sounds like you had that same
Yes, and yes. So I did analysis with Stratomatic. I made these little charts to translate the to understand.
Right.
So what is the actual point count of success here? But then, and I do some of that with the other games as well. But then the other game I encountered, and the only one that was kind of close to a war game was in high school, was Diplomacy.
Oh, yeah.
And that's the opposite in that the rules are almost non-existent, and it's purely based on player interaction and treachery.
That's why I'm terrible at it.
And so that was an eye-opener in that a game didn't have to be complex in order to have depth, so that's kind of started me thinking about it as something that had to be designed and thought about, and not only about adding things to, but also subtracting things from.
Which seems to be like the great lesson that you learn from all really good designers is it's all about trying to figure out how much you can take away from your design and still have it be a good working design. That paring it back seems to be like the actual key.
Yes, whenever I'm working on a game or consulting with someone on their game, if there's a problem in the game or something that's not working, to me the best solution is solve that by taking something away.
Right.
Not by adding another modifier or another rule or another system.
Right.
Yeah.
Was that knowledge you came to? Well, you said you.
But that took a long time.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So I lived in New York City for many years. I moved there to go to college, and I knew about SPI.
Oh.
I was into gaming, not so much into wargaming, but they advertised in magazines back then, like Analog and National Lampoon and so forth. So I went to I was just curious, so I went to their offices. I was I think my freshman year of college. I actually was at an art school, a Parsons School of Design, and they were hiring people to work in the warehouse, which at the time was in their offices in Midtown Manhattan. So really not knowing anything about their games, I got a job there assembling games and packing them and taping them up and shipping them out. So I met in 1973 or early 74, Redmond, and at the time Howard Barash was there, and Rich Berg was hanging around a little bit, and Jim Dunnigan. But I was just like this guy in the stockroom, you know. But then over the next, then I went on to other school jobs, but I was interested enough in the magazine to subscribe to it, to see what they were doing. The game seemed terribly complex to me, and I had no one to play with them with.
Right. Did you go to? They had such famous weekly playtests.
Well, when I was in school, I didn't go to them. But then, when I got out of school and I was working, and I actually had more time, because they worked you very hard at Parsons.
Right.
Then I went back there because I was really interested in trying to play the games, and I knew they did playtesting Friday night. So I went back in 1977 and started playtesting there. And that just developed into first helping out on some games, and then being hired to be a kind of a developmental assistant for practically no money.
Right.
And then during that time, I tried my hand at designing a game based on the Panzer-Guderian system. That game was called Rostov.
Right, yeah. And was that your first?
That was my very first game design.
Right, yeah.
Other than feeble attempts in high school or with friends to do something.
I can picture the cover of that game, and it's like.
Well, so I did that game, and they liked it, and that got me a job as a full-time developer. And they decided it was a folio-sized game. The map was 22 by 17. So they said, well, let's get 3 more games on the East Front in World War II and make a quad.
Right, yeah.
So I was the developer of the quad, and 3 other people designed the other games. Steve Patrick, Brent Nosworthy, and Joe Angelillo did the other games, but I developed them and developed the whole package. And that kind of got me on my way. And then I was a developer for Battles for the Ardennes. I worked some with Joe Balkowski on his Operation Typhoon, which he developed from Joe Angelillo's design. And then my first design work there was, I think, I did a little capsule science fiction game called Stargate.
Right. Yeah,
Stargate. And then I think the first thing I actually designed was a co-designed with Howard Barash of Freedom in the Galaxy.
Right, which was a pretty big hit too.
Yes, that was very popular. And in fact, SBI sold it later in their life to, later, just like 2 years, to Avalon Hill. And Avalon Hill put out a practically identical edition of it. And that sold pretty well for them.
Right.
So that had a pretty long life. It's out of print now.
Right.
Yeah.
And then, were you with SBI right to when they were sold?
Yes.
Or they sold themselves?
So SBI, it was a great place to work, and I met people there that have, become lifelong friends. And among them was Eric Lee Smith and Mark Herman, and then other people I worked with there, Bob Breyer, Ted Kohler, were also friends. And so when SBI was collapsing, there was a move by some of us, led by Mark, to, instead of going to TSR, which was acquiring SBI underhandedly, we went and started Victory Games, and that was really Mark's doing.
But fantastic. It was. Yeah. There's some amazing games coming out of that tiny period.
Yes, they carried a lot of the SBI tradition. Unfortunately, one of the casualties, so to speak, of SBI was that Redmond Simonson stopped doing work in game design, and his impact on the look and the function, the systems of game design is kind of immeasurable.
Yeah. Anybody who thinks of him simply as a graphic designer, it's more than that. It's more like user interface design.
Yes. Before it was called that. Yeah. But that is exactly right. Yeah. Yeah. In fact, that's the field I went into, as a full-time job after I got out of game design for a while. So I was at Victory, and for them did Ambush with Eric Smith, and I did Hell's Highway. When I was still at SPI, I designed some other things also, like the Universe role-playing game and Voyage of the Pandora.
Right, which we'll get back to it later.
We'll get back to that.
That's going to have a new life or something, I think.
Delta V was a tactical space combat game, and I did Battle Over Britain. That was a big... So this is an example. So getting back to the idea of simplifying, instead of making more complex, Battle Over Britain was done early in my career, and it's overblown. There's just too much detail in it for the story it's really trying to tell. And so I was happy to have the opportunity some years later in the mid-'80s to revisit that with RAF. Right.
Yeah.
And then again years later when I learned more about the research material that became available from the UK, I revised RAF and did a new edition.
Right.
In around 2008 or so.
Well, I'm going to talk about I think all three of those games along the way, but I want to get back to Ambush for a minute because I have a few thoughts about that game. I'm not a big solo game player. I tend to be one of those guys who prefers to play a two-player game by myself, that sort of thing. But sometimes I think it's because I loved Ambush so much, and I played it so much, and it was like, this is the way I like to play a solo game. This was my kind of solo game. But when I look back on that game, I think, oh my God, it must have been like writing a novel. Like there was so much text for you and Eric Lee Smith to write in that, right?
Yes, and it was a lot of work just to also edit and proofread and just make sure that everything connected, because there were, if you recall, as you moved along of any of your men moved on the map, you had to check on a kind of cross-reference on a little hex grid, and then a slider, and then it would direct you to a paragraph, and that had to be checked and rechecked and all that. And
for anybody who doesn't, it was sort of like a choose your own adventure book, where you go from paragraph to paragraph, but when you're moving, there's also a map and there's counters, and when you're moving your pieces or they come into contact with the enemy, you resolve that, and then you go to another paragraph after that's all done, right? So it must have been this is pre-computers. This is not, you can't keep all your how these paragraphs all relate to each other.
Yeah, it was at the dawn of the microcomputer.
Right. Yeah. Because this is like 86 or something, right?
Yeah.
So
83.
Right.
But the precursor to it was Voyage of the Pandora.
And that had a similar system?
Well, yes. So in Voyage of the Pandora, you were exploring an alien world, or several different alien worlds. But your team, with a bunch of little characters in it, crew members, was in one location. They didn't move around separately. They were in one place. So when you were crafting a narrative about that, you didn't have to worry about location and relative position and where the enemy might be. It was just like, the group encounters this monster, or there's this strange object to enter and explore, and you just go through a narrative, make choices, either make choices or fail checks or things like that, and then you go to other paragraphs, but then it wraps around and it's concluded, and then you move on, and maybe something else happens, maybe it doesn't. So that was manageable. I did that game in the context of being, issue number 6 of Ares. So there was only a certain amount of time to do it.
Right.
And then we were, in the office at SBI, we were thinking, well, could something else be done with this system? And so Bob Ryer and I think Michael Moore, who worked with him, wrote a proposal for a game which I think was called Combat in the proposal. And that was to take the Voyage of the Pandora system and apply it to a squad of, American soldiers in World War II. And sounded great. We'll do the same thing.
Right.
So but SBI, so it got a pretty good response, but SBI folded.
And then you went on to Victory.
And then we went to Victory. We brought the idea with us. And we started to work on it. Bob wasn't really a designer. He had some ideas for the game, but he didn't have the time to do it because he was our editorial director at SBI and at Victory. So I took it on, and as I started to work with it and show people ideas for how it could work, it became clear that as a squad of soldiers, if there was going to be kind of any reality about firing weapons and the enemy, wasn't going to be happening in one location. They were going to be on a map. They were going to be moving from place to place separately, and that meant they'd be seeing different things, and we had to account for all of that.
Multiple points of view.
Yeah, multiple points of view. So it got exponentially more complex. And so
so instead of being just a counter of a squad, you've got 7 counters of 7 soldiers, or whatever the number is.
Yes, and so the solutions we came up with were successful, and they were complex from the player's perspective, but from the design and narrative perspective and scripting, it was, I think, probably the most complex thing written at its time.
Yeah,
And we did 8 missions in the first box, and I did 4 of them, and Eric did 4 of them. But each one was like a binder of material.
So, I mean, and that game was really well received. It was like nobody's seen anything like it. So it was no surprise that there were sequels. Did you make the sequels?
No, because I left Victory Games after being there about a year and a half to go work for Coleco, the company that was doing ColecoVision and things like that. And so Eric and then a fellow named Joe Reiser, who also did some work with us at SPI. He kind of took over the series. I didn't do any work on it. I was not there anymore.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I think I'd read something you'd written about, like that it was such a huge project that you couldn't imagine tackling something like that again.
Right, and we were able to do it because all of us working on it were working full time, as staff employees, and so we just devote all our energy to it, that really wasn't possible in later years when I was doing freelance game design and having a full-time job. So I never, people always said, let's do it again. And first of all, the rights are owned by Hasbro. Second of all, if someone wants to do something like it, they don't need me. They could do it. But I think, so I didn't want to deal with that again.
Well, just to sidetrack it a little bit, the way the business works now too, like that was the end of the time when there was staff designers and staff developers as full-time jobs, really. Not just in in our part of the hobby. That was, I think that was pretty much it. After
so there
Victory was it.
So Avalon Hill continued with the design staff. So Victory, I guess, went until the early 90s. And Avalon Hill continued to the late 90s. And then the people who were wanting to stay in full-time game design were going into video and computer games, and there was a lot of very successful transition in that. A lot of people did quite well. In my case, I got involved in actually interactive design for museums.
Oh.
So that's what I did from the mid-'80s until about 2010.
And so that would also have kind of been your interest in user interface.
Yes.
Was like a big part of that then.
So and that was like nascent. When I started working in museums in the mid-'80s, computers were just becoming something that possibly could be used in a public setting, like the idea of a touch screen and that sort of thing. So a lot of all the work I did for museums was interactive, but that doesn't necessarily mean it was electronic or digital. A lot of it was manual interactive, things to manipulate, things to explore. I did a lot of work in children's museums, science centers, natural history, that sort of thing.
Stuff that makes the museums come alive a little bit rather than just looking at things behind glass and a plaque, right?
But then as technology advanced, museums started to get more involved in the digital space and in touchscreen interaction or interfaces that could be understood by the public at a glance. So that's where simplicity came in, and that's where I kind of leveraged some of my work in game design to develop interactive experiences that were engaging and yet understandable to someone just walking up to it for the first time.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, because in that world, nobody's going to read instructions about how to...
Right.
It's got to be instantly understandable what you need to do to get the experience, right?
Yeah. Well, and that took me a little while to get when I first started working in the field, because, I would present something and they would say, well, how will people use it? And I'll say, well, they'll read this instruction. And they're like, no, they won't. And I was like, oh, yeah, they won't, will they?
It makes sense in hindsight, but
yeah.
And when we think of what the museum experience is like today, where people like yourself have made it so you walk up to an exhibit and it's immediately clear what you're to do to interact with it.
Yeah, and that developed then into real interaction design, user interface design, and that's what I was doing throughout the 2000s until I retired 3 years ago.
But you did work a little bit with Shenandoah as well. A little bit of
that's
computer gaming.
Yeah, so I kind of left game design in the mid to late 80s, board game design. I did do a project with Prodigy Services, which was an early. I did Baseball Manager. I designed the game Baseball Manager for
Going
them.
Back to your status.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Although I was, for stats for that and for the processing of stats and understanding stats, I relied heavily on Bill James and the whole sabermetrics,
fantastic,
which had developed in the interim.
Yeah.
So that's still Baseball Manager, although Prodigy's long gone. It still exists online somewhere.
Oh, great.
Yeah. Then I was really just I got out of the hobby, but then in the early when Redmond Simonson passed away in 2004, I kind of just revisited the work that I had done, and not as product, but as a creative endeavor, because that's what working with Redmond was.
Right.
It was a creative process. It was collaborative. Redmond, usually knew best because he really did know best. But it just got me thinking again and about how much I enjoyed the creative process of designing a game. So I had just read Joe Balkowski's book on Omaha Beach, and I thought that I could make a game of that. And I just started doing that on my own, and then when that was getting published, or I had a publisher for it, and they were asking if I wanted to do anything else, I was thinking about RAF again, because I had seen the game from Lee Brimacombe Wood called Burning Blue.
Burning Blue, yeah.
And his research and scholarship in that game just blew me away. And so we got in contact, and he talked about how he much enjoyed RAF, but that it was all wrong. So we talked about that, and he turned me on to that a lot of new research had been declassified or made public by the British government on that period, and he used it in his game. And so I looked at that, and it made me rethink how the game should work.
You had your first version of RAF, and then you got to redo it.
Yeah.
Was the first version solo?
It was solo, only the British side. It was just a British game solo.
And then in the second one, you made it soloable from either perspective.
Yeah, so it's really 3 games in that box. It's solo British, solo German, and there's a 2-player.
Right. The same thing you do with your enemy action games, and
that's right.
Makes it way more attractive to everyone.
Oh, well, thank you. And with RAF, I changed a lot of the design as well. The whole fatigue system, and the system of how the British strategically managed their pilots and kept their squadrons from becoming too green.
Right.
That sort of thing. So that was really good.
Well, since we're talking about that game and your solo games, we might as well talk about that a bit, because you've done quite a few solo games that Ambush is one kind of thing where we talk about these other ones where you can play either side or opposed, which is a whole different thing. And then you have the D-Day at series, which is a whole, you have a lot of different solitaire systems, for lack of a better word. Is solitaire something that really appealed to you as a player, or what drew you to making so many solitaire games?
Well, that's so. With Voyage of the Pandora, it was because Jim Dunnigan had done a game called Wreck of the Pandora, which was a solitaire game, not paragraph based, not narrative.
Right.
It was kind of inspired by the first Alien movie.
Right.
And so it's a spaceship that's been overrun by some kind of xenomorph.
Right.
And you're trying to survive and eliminate
this drifting spaceship.
Right. And so that was just done with but it was done with tables and probability dice rolls and things like that. But so Voyage of the Pandora was, let's do what happened with that crew, who they were and what their mission was before all this disaster.
A prequel.
Yeah, a prequel. So but then I thought, yeah, but this new game is about going from planet to planet and exploring things, and what's that going to be like? So the idea of a branching narrative and all these little entry points to it, just, I don't know, it just kind of came to me. So it just, yeah, it was the first game to use a branching passage structure.
Right.
First board game. I think it had already been done in books, though. There were adventure books for young readers where you made some choices, choose your own adventure. I'm not sure it was called that, but those
like
preceded
that,
it.
But it was the first time there was a game.
The first time done in a game.
Yeah.
So there's that. But then I guess the second big solo game was RAF, the one I did for West End.
Yeah.
But that grew out of doing the first game I mentioned with SPI, Battle Over Britain, with a 2-player game, and one of the frustrations in designing that game was that the German player, we had to build in idiot rules for the German player because like they didn't know that attacking the radar net heavily could have won the battle. Right. They just didn't know that. In hindsight, we know that might have worked.
Right.
And the forward airfields, right? They were concentrating on industrial targets, but it turned out that the British industrial system could more than keep up with the rate at which they were bombing. The infrastructure was being damaged. So I thought, well, how can we deal with that in this game and make it simpler? And then, the German shouldn't be a player. If the German can be programmed and be kind of a paper AI, we can build in that lack of knowledge on their part and still keep the live player guessing, because there's a possibility they'll still attack the radar.
Right.
And you have to prepare for that, and it can happen in the game. So the German strategy with some variability built in became handled by the AI. Although back then the term AI was not very well used, not used. Yeah. The term bot I don't think existed.
No.
Yeah. So I just called it the solitaire system. That's what we called it. So the game grew out of not of a desire to make a solitaire game, but of a desire to solve that design problem.
Right. The problem was there's no realistic way to make this a good experience for the German player.
Right.
So let's eliminate that player, and then suddenly we have a game.
Right. And then with Ambush and RAF and Voyage of the Pandora, I kind of became known as a solitaire designer. But then I didn't really think of it that way. But then I was out of the hobby for many years, and when I came back, as I mentioned, I read Joe's book about Omaha Beach. I didn't set out to do a solitaire game there either. Oh. I thought I'm going to design a game on Omaha Beach. But then as I worked on it and thought about the German choices, there were no German choices. Right. They had to stay in their bunkers and kill as many people as they possibly could before they were overrun, and then they were overrun.
Right.
So where's the tension here? And the tension really is upon reading Joe's book, it's how the hell did the Allies succeed that day? Because the plan turned out to be a disaster. The pre-bombardment didn't happen, and it was up to the ingenuity of the leaders on the beach and the men on the beach to figure out how to do it. And I wanted the game to be about that struggle and the discovery of a way to win in the face of this unrelenting fire. So I said, I'm going to make the unrelenting fire the system. And if two players want to play, they can split command, one the 1st Division, one the 29th Division. Right. But yeah, I think this can work. So I started to develop a system to support that.
Had you done a book or a game on Dieppe as well?
Oh, after that, I did.
That was after that.
Yes.
Because it's sort of the same thing, like a big plan that totally goes wrong, and And in that case, it doesn't succeed. But it's that same thing. Like, how could it succeed?
Right. So once Omaha Beach was published, and people were saying, "Wow, you did this great solitaire system for invasion games," and I was like, "What? I did." That's a system?
You're the opposite of Volko. Volko starts by going, I want to make a system. And what's the game? You get the game, and then it's like,
right.
Somebody has to tell you.
And I said, well, I mean, you can't do this for Utah Beach because that was a cakewalk. That's the comparison. That's not really fair to call it a cakewalk. But then in discussion with the publisher, with Decision Games, and with people who played this game, they mentioned the island invasions in the Pacific and Dieppe,
right?
Which was a total disaster. So Dieppe I did as a strategy and tactics issue game for Decision,
right?
And I'm glad I did it that way because it was enough to tell the story that way. We have discussed doing a boxed version of it someday, but not working on that now. But I did do Tarawa and Peleliu, and those took a while because I knew nothing about Pacific warfare.
Right.
And but looking at it, through the lens of what I knew about Normandy and Omaha Beach, and then reading all of the accounts, it was fascinating how different they were. And that the same, one of them was before, Tarawa was before D-Day, before Omaha. Right.
Yeah.
So the evolution of the misunderstanding of how to do island invasions by the military. And now in each case there was some disasters that befell because of it, but I enjoyed working on those games because they presented a lot of different problems. And if you know the Tarawa game, they ended up having to wade through hundreds of yards of water because they couldn't get a lot of the landing craft beyond the coral reef.
Right.
So that's in the game.
They get disembarked way out.
Yeah, so that makes that game different, and then of course the approach the Japanese take to fighting, and given the different environment. So those and Peleliu, even with other differences, I enjoyed working on those two games. But I think I've done enough with the system now.
Right.
Now that I learned it was a system.
It sounds to me a little bit like once you've mastered your own system, you're happy with it, and somebody else could make D-Day at whatever, and you'd be happy to see what else somebody else does, and you're going to come up with something else.
Right. And I guess what I'm saying is, although Omaha Beach became a game system, everything in that design was to serve the simulation of Omaha Beach.
Right.
I didn't look beyond that.
Right.
Right.
I totally get that.
Yeah.
I wonder when you're making. I wonder this always when talking to people who design solo games. When you're thinking of the player experience, how do you decide how tough to make it? Like how many, in 100 plays, how many times should the player win? Because that's when you're doing a 2-player game, you're trying to serve history, and you're kind of trying to make it 50-50 if you can, like with whatever levers you can to sort of adjust the victory conditions or whatever.
Yeah.
But a solo game, you're not probably trying to make it 50-50. Like, what's your handle on how that works?
I think my target is like 30-70. You win 30% of the time.
Sure.
And I think that's achieved in Omaha, and in Tarawa, it's around there. Tarawa tends to be vary more. It's a little more flippy. But Peleliu is too hard. When I was looking at the victory conditions for Peleliu, I basically set them at reaching the planned objectives. When you look at the planning maps, where they said they would be at the end of that time period, and they didn't come close to reaching that. And so I was probably too tough on the player there.
Right. So you said you have to do you have to do what they wanted to do, not what they did.
Yes, because
right?
I got these complaints that say, hey, look, this is where the Americans reached, and I did better than that, so shouldn't I win? and they have a point.
Oh, well, sure.
But the good news is on Peleliu anyway, is people say, yeah, I never win, but I love it every time.
Right, yeah,
So,
and I think it's all about the experience with solo games. But it's funny you say 70-30 because a year ago I was talking to David Thompson, who's also
what does David say about that?
20-80 is his, but
20 win, 80 loss.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. He's even a little bit tougher.
Good.
But
he's meaner than I am, or meaner than I think I am.
I think you guys are both sort of in the same ballpark. As it's like it's just nowhere near 50-50. It's like you really have to work to beat this system.
Yeah.
Or to win.
Well, David, he's inspiring as a designer because he looks at more kind of elegant and visually simple solutions. You got to admit the map for Omaha Beach is pretty complex looking.
Right. Yeah,
right. But he boils things down more. And I like that.
I think with David, he comes a little bit. Not that he designed. Well, I think he started designing not historical games, but more Euro hobby type games.
Is that right?
And I think he brought a lot of that with him. So his games are totally historical now, but he's really conscious of user interface, to use the modern word. He doesn't want anybody looking up at a bunch of charts and tables, and he wants everything to be there on the map right in front of you. And I find his games really elegant as well, for sure.
Yeah.
So, were you thinking that? I also wonder about like your second edition of RAF, and then the two games of enemy actions where you play either side or both. That's like we got to take this whole 30-70 thing and throw it out the window.
Yeah.
Somehow,
Well.
Right?
Yeah, that's right, because it's so the enemy action series kind of goes against everything I've said about. So I had I'd done the D-Day series and RAF, and I was looking at card-driven games, and I was thinking two things. I haven't seen kind of an operational level card-driven game. They're strategic the Civil War, the War in the Pacific, World War One, that sort of thing. And no one has successfully designed, or maybe even attempted, a solitaire game at a fully mobile battle in a typical war game hex grid where the enemy is able to compete with a live player across a ever-changing front. Right? I'm going to do it. So
that's a huge ask. Like solo games are usually like one side is so much less mobile. But you pick the bulge.
So I picked the bulge because I knew the bulge. Because we haven't discussed it, but I developed Battles for the Ardennes with Danny Parker, which was a great experience.
Right. Mr. Bulge.
Yeah, Mr. Bulge. Right. And I played many Bulge games and done some work on some other Bulge game projects. So I knew the material. I knew where to look to get what I needed, the orders of battle, battlefield. I knew everything about the battle, so I could focus on the system. Right. I said, let me pick something I don't have to research. So that's why and that would be a popular subject.
So when you're coming to this game, did you know it was going to be soloable both ways?
I knew going in that I was trying to design a two-player game that was going to be fun, card-driven, and that you could play also as either side, solo.
So you made you made a double sort of
right. But to make sure it was a good operational level war game, I completed the 2-player game all the way before even thinking about how to do the solo game.
Right.
So I made that. It's a card driven by formation, and I was very pleased with how that came out. And when I'd done that and it was testing, then I started working first on the German solo version, where the American, the allies are controlled by the system. And then when that was done, then I did the other one, and I thought, I'll just reverse whatever I come up with for the American defense, I'll just apply to the German offense. Well, of course, even saying that makes no sense. So it's really, when if you play the 2 solo games, they are not the same system themselves.
Right. Yeah, you had to completely think of it another way.
Yeah. Whereas the Americans could be kind of these reactions, piecemeal. The Germans had to attack with a coordinated strategy.
Well, that's what I think the wonder of that game is coming up with a system that automates a coordinated attack. Solo systems are generally so much better being reactive, as you say.
Yes, that's right. That's why I did the American side being the AI first, because that looked simpler. Just put a bunch of roadblocks out. That'll solve it.
Right. Yeah. So, but how was that to dive into going I'm going to be the guy who makes a solo system where the solo attacks?
It was 6 years long. That's how it was.
I don't doubt it.
I think so, from conception to publication.
Right.
Yeah.
But it was a big hit too. That's another one of the a real hit game.
Yeah, and I had the pleasure of working with John Foley to develop Enemy Action Ardennes. He was a developer for Combat Commander.
Right. Oh, okay.
And he was so supportive and helpful throughout the process. And it was published by Compass when Ken Dingley worked there, and Ken did great work on coordinating the graphics and working with me on the play aids and that sort of thing. So that came out very nicely.
And did that, after being through that 6-year push to get that, how when you came to revisit the system,
right? So since I accepted that it was a system from the beginning, I knew if it was successful, I'd do something else with it. So I said, well, let me go. This time I'll do something that I'm kind of familiar with, but would need to research, and that was Third Battle of Kharkov. And I picked that because, unlike the Ardennes, which is in a constrained terrain and that greatly kind of funneled where things could happen and slowed things down, let me do something wide open and sweeping where the enemy's going to go anywhere, and basically the Soviet attack took almost the entire map away from the Germans, and then the Germans take almost the entire map back.
But having all that open space must have made it incredibly mind-bending to do the solo stuff again.
Well, see, I didn't realize that. I thought, since it's a simple hex grid, then there'll be a lot less I don't know what I thought. But that was absolutely the problem, because not the problem, but the challenge, because now the other side had so many more options of where to go and how far they could go in a given activation. And so there was a lot more, decision trees that had to be addressed. So I thought it was going to be much easier than Ardennes, and it was not. So that was another, was it 6 years? In 2015, it came out in, no, I guess that was 5 years.
But still.
But again, I did the 2-player first, and was very happy with that as a 2-player game, and then did the solos.
It's funny when you think you're picking something and it's going to make it easier, and then when you get into the weeds, you go, my gosh, it's exactly the opposite. Well, that when you were, just to wrap up the solo stuff that I wanted to talk about. So once you've done the 2-player games and you're doing these solo sides each way, how do you manage to do make the choices on the 70-30 thing? Does that even enter into it?
In those games, it's not 70-30.
It's more like the 50-50 sort of.
Yeah, it's going to be maybe 64. You'll win 40 or 45% of the time, I think.
Right. It's more like playing a human.
Yeah, because there's a lot more variability, and I want every game to feel very different. The initial attacks and the situation you have to deal with when you start play and is going to vary a lot every game.
Right.
And so some games will be easier to win than others that when you play it. But because the two-player game in both those enemy action volumes, I think is balanced.
Right. Yeah.
People say the Germans are a little hard to win with in Ardennes.
I always find that you get a lot of comments about balance by people who've played a game once or twice.
That's a good point. So here in this, the solo game is I think you can win more easily than you can my D-Day games.
Right.
But sometimes you'll get slammed too.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's okay.
Yeah.
Backing up, we talked about we skipped a game, your Hell's Highway game.
Oh, well, that was a two-player game.
Because that's a two-player game.
And remains a two-player game.
We were talking about how you'd become this solo guy, but I was like,
right.
There's this kind of important game there that was a two-player game.
Right. So, so I didn't see myself as a solo guy.
Yeah.
Because I did plenty of two-player games in my work at SBI. And then Hell's Highway was a game on Operation Market Garden. I wanted to try out a new kind of combat system and a new method of managing tactical and strategic movement in that game and supply.
And that was a pretty popular game from the Victory Games period as well.
Yes. Yes.
I have a copy. It was at that time when the counters were small and they were trying to squish everything into the middle.
Yeah, that was actually a production error.
Yeah, but totally. Those things happen. But as I understand it, you're working on you were going to relook at that whole game?
Yes. So I'm working on a new version, and we're calling it On Hell's Highway, differentiated. And by we, I mean Mark Hinkle at New England Simulations. He is an amazing graphic artist and designer, and also he owns that. He's the owner of New England Simulations. They just published Winner's Victory and
their components
and
are
Jaws
beautiful.
of Victory before that. It's just gorgeous components and extremely functional. So I'm delighted to be working with him on that. He's working on the map now. The game is being updated and streamlined. I think people will be pleased with it. Some order of battle corrections. The combat system is kind of the same, but much less chart heavy and more results built into the combat results table, so you don't have to do as much kind of modifier calculation.
The things the things that inspired you when you created it the first time, they're still there in this this second edition.
Yes, that's right.
Is there any timeline for this? Or
There's not a date for release, but we plan to play it together at Consim World, which is in late July, mid-July, and that'll be up to Mark. I'm entirely happy with whatever schedule works best for him, because he's doing the graphics and all the production work, and then all the print coordination.
Right. So sort of as it happens, we'll find out a date down the line.
Yeah.
When it must be interesting to you revisit our RAF and you made some changes that you were really happy with.
Yeah.
And this is another time when you can. It's like 40 years later, almost, from that publication.
Definitely. I think it came out in 83.
Oh, so there we go.
Yeah.
So it must be really interesting to go, I was really proud of that game when it first came out, but I've learned so much more about design, and to have the chance to go, I'm going to take another shot at this and put what I've learned into it. That it's not just the order of battle, the stuff that we know or whatever, but
so that's why I say I think people will find it streamlined and simpler to play, and sometimes it's a matter of removing things that bring diminishing returns, where there was a lot of effort into something the player had to keep track of for very little payoff.
Right.
Getting rid of that sort of thing.
That's going back to what we were first talking about. The taking away is sometimes the most important part. Yeah. Well, I get it. I'm totally looking forward to revisiting that game as well.
Cool.
But one other game I really wanted to talk about was since we're here at GMT and your most recent release, Downfall, where you've taken Chad Jensen's almost design, but as I understand the story, Chad was very meticulous about prototyping and charts and pieces and all that, but pretty much kept the rules and the mechanics in his head while he was working on a game.
Yes.
So when he passed away and Kai came to you and said, let's see if we can take this over the finish line, you could see what the game looked like, and you may have played it a bit with him, but there was no written...
I approached Kai, I think.
Oh, did you?
Well, there was Gene and Kai said that they were trying to figure out what to do with the work that Chad left unfinished.
Right.
And including Downfall. And I had seen prototype copies of it when I would go to their place, because I used to play games with them, and we worked together on Space Corp. So I said, I'd like to try to bring it to the finish line, and Gene and Kai were very happy with that.
Right.
So there we go.
What was the experience of that like, trying to... I mean, you had played the prototype, so you had...
I hadn't played it.
Oh, yeah? You just seen it?
No, Chad wouldn't let me, because he said, that's not quite ready.
Right.
Yeah. Something with the combat system isn't working.
Right. So you've seen it, but you hadn't
I'd seen it, and he told me about how it worked, and the initiative system, and the order system. And
you were
and I was like, oh my God, I want to play this so bad.
Right.
But
had you played the old Battle for Germany game that had sort of had the...
I had, and that is something they have in common, but I would challenge anyone who says, oh, it's like a new version of Battle for Germany, to play the game and say that again.
Right. The only thing that's the same is the way the German forces are...
Yes, are managed by the players.
By the players,
and that was... But that wasn't... I mean, that was a brilliant idea by Jim Dunnigan, and Battle for Germany is a great little game. Chad didn't start with that either.
Oh.
He wanted to do... He loved Totaler Krieg and some of the other strategic level war in Europe games, and he wanted to do one. And he started out with a 2-player game that was Germans against the Allies, and then he had a 3-player game, which was the Germans against the West, and the same player manage, Germans against the East, and which is kind of like the strategic game.
Triumph and Tragedy.
Triumph and Tragedy. And he went through all these different models for the game, and then he settled on this because it seemed like it would be the most fun for, and not settled, but he arrived at this because that would be the way to keep the players engaged in the game all the way through, from beginning to end. Because if you're playing a World War II strategic game as the Germans, there comes a point after high water mark when all you're doing is trying to retreat as slowly as you can. And that's it. And right? So his solution, and starting it so early in the war, Battle for Germany starts in December of 44, right near the very end. And this begins in November of 42. So, at the German high water mark, the Germans are in Stalingrad. So So anyways, yeah, so he had this design. He had the map finished. He had the counters finished. He had the cards finished, which is amazing that he would, and a play aid with a complete combat results table and, movement costs and things like that. And from those, but no rules, and that's not unusual for him. He said, "I don't want to write rules until I know. I don't want to waste my time writing rules that are going to have to be rewritten, or that then constrain me from, thinking about the game, parts of the game that should remain fluid while we develop them." So, Kai hadn't played it for some time, and she had played various versions and didn't have a clear recollection of where he'd settled on it. Yeah. So, so she told me what she could, and then I went from there and just played with what he did have and constructed what I thought was the game from that, and brought it back to Kai and talked her through it, and she said, "If that's not it, it's great." Right. I think it. Yeah.
Well,
so
was that maybe Chad's only strategic? I think of Chad as just
Combat
Comic Commander and Fighting Formations and
Dominant Species,
more tactical scale stuff. So maybe that was his. You couldn't look at his other games and go, "Well, this is what he."
Well, he did Fighting Formations, which had some similarity in its initiative and order system.
Its initiative system is great. I love that system.
It's not exactly like this one. But then he has another unpublished game, which was on the P500 for a while, and it might be now also, Golden Gate Park.
Oh, I don't know that one.
I played that with him here one year, and that was a delightful game about making the most of your day at Golden Gate Park. And that is literally what it was about.
Right.
You had a certain amount of time, which was like the initiative track, to go and enjoy the various things in the park and to kind of almost earn I forget what he called them, but enjoyment points for your family. You were families. You played a family going around the park, and whoever had the most fun by the end won the game. And there were other aspects to victory, but you could do things in the game that took a certain number of hours, and some took more hours than others. So just like in Downfall, you do an order that will cost you from 2 to 20 initiative.
Right.
And if you do one that costs 20 initiative, you're not going to go for a while again because other people will be behind you. And it was the same thing in that was exactly the mechanic in the Golden Gate Park game.
Right, and it's like the mechanic in Fighting Formations. If you swing the thing to the other guy's side, he's going to get a few goes before the initiative slides back your way. If you choose something that costs too much.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So he brought that idea, and that mechanically, that's much more what the game is about than Battle for Germany. Right. It's about that, and it's about his order system, where you have this slate of 12 order markers that you choose from, each one with a different initiative cost, and they're not all available at the same time.
Right.
You have to kind of balance what's available to you against what's available to the other players and plan accordingly. And that back and forth meant that game, its strategic level World War II game, 0 downtime.
Right.
You are engaged every minute of play.
Right.
And that is why so many people I've talked to say now it's their favorite strategic level Europe game, World War II Europe game, and that's one of the main reasons is the interactive nature of the play.
Right. It's not like in the old days when we were playing Third Reich and you could go have a cup of coffee while the other guy,
or a meal
while the Russian moves his pieces.
Right.
Well, I'm congratulations on the success of that game. It must feel like, I know Chad and Kai, great friends of yours, and so it must have felt good that it turned out as well as it did. Sort of for your friend.
Yeah, it was an honor to work on the whole time, and every time I learned more about the game, I was more impressed with its innovation, and I wanted to make sure to preserve that. And there were testers and other people involved in the game who would say to me, well, I should change this to that. I said, oh no, I am not. Now, that's not to say, I would have changed something if I felt it didn't work.
Right.
And there were some things in the naval system were at least unclear to me, and I had to make some choices there. I'm very pleased with how it came out, and the response, like on Board Game Geek, is pretty universally positive. There's some people who are against it, and that's why not all World War II strategic games appeal to everyone.
Oh no, absolutely.
They're expecting something else. Yeah.
What did I want to say? This is what I want to say. I've seen you here now 3 times, and every time when I see you at this event, you're playing a lot of games. You're definitely one of those designers that obviously believes playing games you don't give up being a player when you become a designer, right?
Oh, absolutely not. And here, especially in more recent years, I'm playing a lot of unpublished games.
Right.
GMT has fostered this great culture of bringing in a lot of new designers and young designers with great, fascinating game ideas. I don't like all of them, but I'm fascinated by all of them.
Yeah, there's got to be a dozen demos out in that other room right now being played, right? It's like
absolutely.
But
I play I play published games too.
Right. Yeah. And you're still an avid player, but it must feed into your design as well.
Oh, definitely. Because there's no design idea that's original.
Right.
It's always inspired by something else, sometimes indirectly.
Right.
But sure. Yeah. And I get so much out of playing games in that regard, and also just because I love to. I mean, my family played games growing up, and I've always enjoyed it.
You're still a player, right?
Yeah, still a player.
So, Downfall was your last published design. What are you working on now?
Well, the big project I'm working on now is Away Team, which is the new exponentially expanded Voyage of the Pandora idea.
And is it another text-heavy?
It is an incredibly text-heavy game. The paragraph book will be well over 100 pages when it comes out. We have 6 different people have been writing on it, including myself and Kai. Kai Jensen has written the training mission. We have Greg Kostikian, who some people may remember. He's one of the legendary designers from SBI and West End games. And David Spangler, Ken Kuhn,
what got
Douglas
you?
Sun.
Oh yeah, no, right.
Yeah.
What got you to do another text-heavy like?
Gene.
He
bugged me about it, man. No, he loved Voyage of the Pandora, and I said, well, I would do something slightly different with it. And if we were going to do a box game of it, I would want it to have an epic quality with a real narrative going on. So that's where a lot of the work has come in, making a game that's exciting to play in terms of the decisions you make, but also tells you an epic story over time. So you can play the game for 60, 70 hours, and it reveals an unfolding.
There's an arc.
Interstellar narrative. You explore about 40 sites in 7 different star systems over this arc.
So, this is another one where you, in some ways, revisiting something from 40 years ago, but now our personal computers. I got to think there's got to be some kind of a benefit to having, when you're working with all these interrelated paragraphs and all that sort of stuff. Yes.
So we actually hired a person to create and manage the database of this game. And there's a database for all the passages, which is the passage book, that allows us to look up any passage and say, okay, how many passages do we have that take place here, right, or that are written in a way that could be used in more than one place, whereas some are not, some need to be unique. And then there's another database, because we have a deck of 152 different encounter cards. Each one's a story of its own.
Oh.
Each card. So, and they relate to the passages and to each other. And so that is all.
So you got a database expert.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That's got to be a big help.
Happens to be my sister, Julie.
Oh.
But she was a project director at Yahoo and at Oracle, so she's qualified.
Yeah. Well, and it must take a giant burden off you too of trying to keep track of all that stuff like you had to do the first time.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, that's great. So that's your big project.
That's
right
the
now.
big project,
Yeah.
and Jason Carr is directing the development of it, and we have a lot of artists already working on it. So on the P500 now, it says it's in art department, but that's because there's so much art. We started early. Right. So it's not all in the art department yet, believe me.
Right.
But we hope to have the work finished by the end of this year.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah.
And that's kind of all consuming. It's a huge project.
Yes.
Right?
So when I get overwhelmed with it, then maybe I take a break and look at some of the other stuff I might be designing in future.
Right.
But nothing right now.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, I'm so glad to finally have met you and talked to you, John. This has been
you too, Grant.
Totally
Thank you.
delightful. Yeah, thanks very much, and best of luck with Pandora.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's Away Team.
Away Team is the new name, right? Yeah.
To not confuse people, we call it Away Team Voyages of the Pandora.
Right.
That,
of course.
That suggests that maybe there'll be an Away Team something else in the future. But
right. If this,
I didn't say that.
Well, yes, we've established you never start out with the idea of making a series.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks very much.
Thank you, Grant.
What did I tell you? Another giant of the hobby who's incredibly humble and curious. Goes to show you, that's just the way the greats are. Okay, time to talk about a game. Let's talk about Norman Conquests, Volume 5 in GMT's Men of Iron series. Originally designed by the late Richard Berg in 2005, this current volume was designed by Ralph Shelton. As the title suggests, this volume features the Normans. It covers the famous battles of 1066, of course, Fulford, Stamford Bridge, Hastings, as well as one earlier, Civitate in Italy, and three later battles. Tichebray sees King Henry heading back to Normandy to fight his brother in 1106, and then this set skips ahead 150 years for the battles of Lewes and Evesham. This is far removed from the Norman conquests. These battles are in the time of Henry III, the first of the Plantagenets. I'm sure this skipping ahead rather than finding a couple more battles closer to 1066 will have some fans of the game upset, just as I'm sure the choice of scenarios is also constrained by how many counters and maps they're budgeting for. But that brings me to the first thing I really notice about the Men of Iron series. I'm a newcomer to the series, having only played a couple scenarios from the Men of Iron tri-pack. Both of those were straight Men of Iron affairs, so no Infidels or Blood and Roses for me yet. Now, I've played a few of the Norman Conquest scenarios as well, and I started rooting around the internet when I had questions. And I should say, as a sideline to all that, the first big thing I noticed about this series is that it is aimed at and appeals to simulationists much more than gamers. You notice that when you start looking through the scenarios. The designers tell you which side is favored. In the original Men of Iron tri-pack, most scenarios also had optional rules that could be used to try to make the battle a little more balanced. So you had a choice of whether to play the scenario as written, as a strictly historical recreation, or you could balance things out with optional rules and give the underdog a bit more of a chance. But for some reason, Ralph Shelton hasn't continued that in this box. Only one of the scenarios has optional rules aimed at balancing the scenario. I don't know, perhaps it was thought that the rest of the battles here are close enough to be considered balanced, even though each scenario still lists one side as favored. In any case, I wish there were more of those balancing options. All that said, even though the series aims more for realism than balance, it doesn't sacrifice playability. This isn't a realism versus playability sort of dyad. Once you've got a scenario or two under your armor, it really moves smoothly. I'm not going to go into super detail as we're now on Volume 5, so many of you will already know how to play, but for those who haven't tried it, here's an overview. You choose a scenario, set out the map in pieces. Most of the pieces have predetermined setup areas, so there's not a choice about where to set up. If you have a line of 5 pikeman units, maybe you might be told which 5 hexes to put them in, and if a couple of the units are better than the others, then your one bit of setup choice might be where to put the better ones in the line. That's about it. 5 of the 7 battles in the box start with each side arrayed in a line facing the other. For me, this takes a bit of the fun out of things, as there's no real room for maneuver if we sort of skip the advance to battle part of an engagement. My left will smash into your right and vice versa. Anyway, each side's units are grouped into slightly larger formations called battles. This is what they were called at the time, but it's a bit of a confusing term for us, as battle means something completely different to us. But think of a battle as a wing or a division, something like that. Each battle has a leader and a standard and 5 to 15 combat units. The units in Norman Conquests are mostly pikemen with a few archers, axemen, and men-at-arms, both mounted and unmounted. There's even a few crossbow units in the later scenarios. There's no turns in Men of Iron. One side is mandated to go first. They choose one of their battles to activate, and play begins. After the original battle is done its activation, that player can try to keep going by choosing another of their battles and rolling versus that battle's leader's activation rating. If they succeed, that battle is now activated, and so on. A player can continue to activate units as long as they keep rolling under the leader's activation numbers. That said, that generally means rolling a 3 or 4 or less on a 10-sider, so it doesn't go on forever. When the active player fails his roll, the inactive player becomes the active player and gets a free activation of any of their battles, and so it goes back and forth until one side is vanquished. When a battle is activated, it goes through a couple steps. First, all the units in the battle can move. Archers or other ranged weapon units can fire anytime during their move, but they must stop as soon as they fire. There's no stacking of units other than leaders and standards, nor can you pass through another unit. The same applies when a unit must retreat. Thus, no retreat path means elimination. There's a couple of exceptions for mounted units and retreating through archers, but that's the general rule. 1 unit per hex and no passing through. Along with that, there are no zones of control. This is spelled out explicitly in the rules, so perhaps it's controversial. It's not uncommon in tactical games, in my experience, to have no zone of control. Anyway, facing is important, however, as flank and rear attacks are extremely deadly and get bonuses. After the fire and movement phase comes the shock phase. This is the hand-to-hand combat part, the real heart of the game. The active player can attack any other of the active battle's units that are adjacent to enemy units. Units don't have to attack, but if they do, they must attack each unit they are adjacent to unless that adjacent unit is already being attacked by another friendly unit. Combat itself is pretty straightforward. A simple D10 roll for each attack with a variety of easily remembered DRMs. Each defending piece has a defensive DRM. There's a matrix for DRMs when a unit of type X attacks unit type Y, for example, when a pikeman attacks an axe unit, etc. There may be a bit of a bonus if the attacker has a leader attached, or a defensive bonus for a train, though train is rare on these maps. So you just add up the DRMs, roll the dice, and check on the CRT. And it only has 2 columns, one for if the defender is fresh and one if the defender is already disordered, which means the counter's been flipped to its reverse side and has a big D and slightly worse ratings. The results will tell you if one side or the other becomes disrupted or has to retreat, or if the defender was already disrupted, they may be eliminated or have to retire. Retire means it is just simply moved from its location and placed adjacent to the leader's standard counter in the rear. If the attacker forced the defender out of the hex, the attacker must advance, and sometimes is also forced to make a follow-up attack with a negative DRM. So sometimes the attacker is forced to continue going with a slightly worse attack that he might not have wanted to make. As I mentioned earlier, if a unit can't retreat, it is eliminated. This is very punishing and makes it imperative to leave a line of hexes clear behind your front line. Felt a bit strange, as I always thought medieval armies had the next units right snug in behind, ready to go, but I'm no medievalist, so that's probably just a misunderstanding on my part. Anyway, after the shock phase is done, it's the rally phase. Any of the activated battle's disordered units that aren't adjacent to the enemy and neither moved nor fired that turn can regain their fresh status. And then that's it for that battle, and it's time for the active player to try to activate the next battle. When it's your turn for a free activation, you don't have to activate a battle. You can activate a standard instead and try to get any of the retired units back into fighting shape, or you can pass. As a mechanism to keep the game moving forward, one side is generally designated as the aggressor and has a time limit to end the game. Each time the non-aggressor passes rather than activating a battle, that time marker moves one click forward. If it reaches the scenario-defined limit, then the defender wins. In my games, it never came close to ending due to time. Activations were too precious for both sides, and the battles were also very bloody and over fairly quickly. So that's the general back and forth. So, how do you win? Both sides have a scenario-specified flight level. Whenever you lose a unit, you'll rack up some flight points. Losing a pikeman costs you 2 points, losing your king costs you 5, having a unit retired costs 1, so forth. Every time there's a free activation, meaning a switch in who is the active player, both players count up their flight points, roll the die, and sum the total. If my flight points plus my die roll are higher than my scenario-specified flight level, I flee and you win. Perhaps I'm just too straightforward, but this flight point business made my scenarios end very quickly in most cases. With the flight limit set under 20, there were quite a few cases where one side got steamrolled very quickly indeed. Makes for quick games. But I don't know. There's part of me that thought the scenarios should have lasted longer, but I have to say, many of the scenarios do have an optional rule that it doesn't affect balance, but it halves the die roll for these flight rolls, so that would lengthen the scenario. I'm going to try that next time and see what it feels like. I'm getting a fuller experience. It also could be just that my method of just smashing the two lines together is it's not the optimal strategy. I wouldn't be surprised. Anyway, it's really a quite straightforward system. As I said, once you get going, the DRMs and procedures stick in your head, and you don't have to refer to the charts nearly so much. So what's it like? I got to say, I'm really eager to play this with a fan. It's not clear to me where strategy and tactics come in. In most cases, as I said, it felt like you line up both sides and smash them into one another. The side with the better luck on activations definitely has an advantage. As a side note, there is also a small subsystem that gives each side a set number of randomly drawn chits. They try to seize the initiative back from the other player. They give you a chance to grab control back when your opponent is on a roll, and you can try and stop him in his tracks. Anyway, my plays were all very bloody affairs, as I said. It felt to me like the player who struck first had a real advantage. I was at a loss as to what to do to counter this. As well, as I said, there isn't a ton of room to maneuver on these maps, and as I mentioned, most scenarios start with units already in place for the battle. There's no chance to change up your lines or try to flank your opponent. I don't know, perhaps when I finally get a chance to play a veteran player, I'll get schooled mercilessly and shown that these things are possible and I'm just too experienced and clumsy. Though no amount of setup, or no amounts of schooling, I should say, is going to change the setup where you're past the approach to battle moment. I don't know. I should also say that I think I did read that the designer said that he purposely has kept the game sort of tight on the flanks because the way the game plays, it was too easy to flank your opponent if he left more space on the flanks. So maybe that's just the way the rules are, and if you open it up more, the system would break down that way. Anyway. Another thing that really jumped out at me when diving into this game is that its fans are really fanatical history fans as well as game fans. I know, of course, we see this throughout the wargaming hobby, but here they take things to the next level, perhaps on a level only matched by the hardcore minis players who argue about colors of buttons and ribbons on painted figures. I certainly don't envy Ralph Shelton or any designer facing these fans. I did an unboxing video of this game when it was first released, and one of the first comments was from a user who was disappointed that the artwork hadn't been updated from the previous Men of Iron tri-pack, so the knight's armor looks off to him. And then on a thread on BNG, there was a dust up about one of the maps not having a certain terrain feature. The designer defended himself by saying which historian he'd used for that particular battle as his research, only to be told that that was the worst historian to consult and that there were 10 other better books he should have read. Felt a bit excessive, but I did agree that perhaps more than a single source per battle would have been wise. And of course, there was also complaints about the inclusion of the later battles rather than the more of William's campaigns back in France. I don't know, you can't please everybody. Anyway, all this made it really clear that the fans are extra serious about the history when it comes to this series, which also makes more sense of what I mentioned earlier about the scenarios not being so much worried about being balanced so much as being strictly historical. And that's the way the fans clearly like it. I'm more of a gamer than a demander of realism, so I was a bit put off by the whole unbalanced scenario business in the beginning, but the game plays so smoothly that I'm willing to put that aside and play some more. You can easily play these back to back, switch sides, do that sort of thing. There is a vassal module for Norman Conquests that is separate from the rest of the Men of Iron series. It looks good, other than sharing one of Vassal's great errors. There's very little in the way of standardization between modules for hotkeys, and that goes across Vassal. In the case of Norman Conquest, for some reason the designer has chosen Control Q and Control E for rotating. Well, there's no standard for these choices. The majority of modules that I've played, and I've played a ton, use either Control open close brackets or Control ZX for rotating counters. Q and E come out of the left field to me. I don't know, perhaps it's a remnant of playing a lot of games that use WASD for movement or something like that. Anyway, that said, the other Men of Iron modules are a complete nightmare. For the other boxes, instead of a single module for, say, Infidel with all the Infidel scenarios in it, there's a separate module for each scenario. Same for Blood and Roses, same for the original Men of Iron. It's just madness. So the Norman Conquest module happily has all the scenarios included in this one module. What it doesn't have is any charts, so you'll have to haul your copy off the shelf to play digitally. That's the publisher's prerogative, but I got to say it makes me a little less likely to play the game. Either that or I hack a copy of the chart scan from my physical copy, which I've done many times just to make it so that I don't have to keep pulling the paper charts out every time I want to play a game, PBM versus via Vassal. Anyway, pretty good looking module other than that. All right, parting shots. This might as well have just gone in the news, but it felt a little strange. Phalanx games also have a new Kickstarter or GameFound, whichever platform they're using. This is for another upgrade kit to their Hannibal and Hamilcar game. For those who haven't been keeping track, this is Mark Simonich's Hannibal game that was originally published by Avalon Hill. It has the distinction of being the first game to use the card-driven game mechanics from Mark Herman's We the People. So while one Mark invented the CGG, another Mark showed it could be used to create a whole new genre of games, regardless of the setting. After Avalon Hill went under, Valley Games got the rights to Hannibal and made a beautiful version. And then they screwed over a ton of investors and went under, and Phalanx picked up the rights. They published their own version and added in their own Hamilcar game in the same box. This edition was met with a bit of a mixed reaction. It added minis instead of standees for their leaders, which people either loved or hated. It changed the dice to custom dice with crazy wild dice sizes. These were pretty much universally hated. And they rewrote the rule book. This was mostly thought to be a failure as well. So a couple of years after publication, they brought out another new version, and owners of the original Phalanx version could buy an upgrade kit. The upgrades were a new rule book with another attempt at writing the rules, more new dice in reasonable sizes, and a bigger box that everything would fit into if you'd bought any of the extras. And if I recall correctly, I think also completely new rules for Hamilcar, as the original of that version of that game just didn't work at all. This version certainly corrected some of the mistakes, but there was still a lot of grumbling about the rulebook. So here we are yet a couple of years later again, and they're coming out with a new version yet again, and once more an upgrade kit is available that the previous owners can purchase. New this time is that Hannibal and Hamilcar look to be 2 completely separate games in their own boxes for anyone buying them new. For the upgrade, the big thing is a new set of rules again for each, and some minor clarifications on a few cards. And they are offering a new set of minis, this time in metal instead of plastic. Previous owners are getting pretty tired of shelling out for fixes for a game they expected to pay for once. Phalanx's response to this type of criticism is to say, hey, just play the original game. You don't have to buy the upgrade kits if you don't want to, which of course is true, but it's also a sure way to make and retain customers, I think. Anyway, I bought the first upgrade kit, and I think I'd be fine without buying this second one. They're going to make the new rules available via PDF, and the new upgrade kit doesn't include the new cards with those little clarifications. I'd have to buy a whole new game to get those. But as they're clarifications and not changes, I can live without it. And of course, knowing me, I totally don't want the metal minis. But in any case, the whole situation just feels janky. Phalanx seems to think they're doing us a favor by never getting the game published properly and then asking us to shell out for consecutive upgrade kits. I don't know. I'm not sure that that's what a favor actually is. Anyway, I hope this is the last upgrade kit and that's the last we hear of it. Thanks again to those who have become ongoing supporters of Pushing Cardboard, either through YouTube or Ko-Fi. And thanks as well to those who took the time to use my affiliate link when shopping at Noble Knight Games. I really appreciate it. And thanks to those who dropped by the website and Discord server. It's great to get to have more of a two-way conversation about games with some of you. That's it for another episode of Pushing Cardboard. That's it for another episode of Pushing Cardboard. You'll hear from me again in a month or two, maybe sooner. I'm working on new ideas for scheduling. Maybe one idea will be shorter episodes or more of them. I don't know. Hard to say. But in the meantime, I'll talk to you online. Happy gaming and talk to you soon.